This video is to help you fill out your Unit 2 exam study guide. You can find the study guide in the pages after Mini Lesson 1, Mini Lesson 2, creating and executing your study plan. The next page is where the study guide starts, and it starts with key vocabulary. So inputs and outputs, kind of the foundation for this whole unit. Every other definition includes inputs and outputs in its definition. So an input is going to be X values, and outputs are your Y values. So usually, or always, your input when we have function notation is whatever's inside the parentheses, and then your output is on the other side. So your input is inside of the parentheses. The entire expression f of x is equal to the output. Okay. When we're told to evaluate a function, it always has to do with inputs and outputs. That might be a good thing to note here. So a lot of questions on your test will tell you to evaluate. What that means, if you remember, is given an input, find the corresponding output. All right, the next vocabulary word is range. So this connects to the first definition of outputs. So the range is all possible output values. Another way of thinking of this is all possible Y values. And range on a graph, like on your quest, you had a question that was like some sort of graph, and the lowest point was 2, I believe, and the highest point was 6 on the y-axis. Therefore, you can conclude the range is between the y values of 2 and 6. So range is always going to be in terms of y values. And the way we would write that with inequality symbols is y is in between 2 and 6. So some of you mentioned in the survey that the most confusing questions for you involved inequalities. Another way of saying this expression is y is greater than or equal to 2 and less than or equal to 6. What that looks like on a number line, if I have room, is 2, 6. It means y is greater than 2 but less than 6. So if you can see that visually, it actually is the same thing as saying y is in between these two values. It's in between 2 and 6. Let's write that out. Y is in between 2 and 6. So here we have the representation with an inequality, we have the verbal representation and the representation on a number line, and a graph. So we have 4 different representations going on, which sometimes happens in math. Okay, the domain, in contrast, is all possible input values. Which is, as we know, X values. So if we use the same type of graph, this time we care about the values along the x-axis because we're looking at domain or input values. So we could say the domain maybe is between 1 and 10. So the lowest possible x value on the x-axis is 1. The highest possible x value on the x-axis is 10. So the domain is going to be all x values between 1 and 10. And the way we'd write that as an inequality is the domain is x values between 1 and 10. All right, moving on to the next page. Thank you. piecewise functions. So again, relating this back to our first definition of input, a piecewise function, the output changes depending on the input. So it's a function whose output value depends on input value. So what does that actually mean? Well, the way that it's going to look in a graph is it's going to have multiple different pieces or different domains. So let's draw something that looks like that. All right, so in writing an equation for a piecewise function, as we know, we'd actually have to write equations for 3 different lines and then define the domains for those 3 different lines. So the function rule would look something like y equals, we'd have equation, domain, equation, domain, equation, domain. So the function is behaving differently depending on the input value that it's taking on. So in different domains, the function is going to follow a different rule or a different equation. And we're going to have a problem later on in the study guide where we go through how to write one of these function rules. That's going to be one of your free response questions on the exam. Make a note of that here. So one free response question is going to be writing a function rule for a piecewise function. All right, next definition is composite function. So composite function is a function made up of 2 or more parts. And the output of one function becomes the input into the other. All right, and this composite function, we can think of it as having a baby and a mom. Normally it would look something like f of g of x, where the function on the inside we would call the baby, and the function on the outside we would call the outside function, or we could also call the mom. And important thing to remember with composite functions is you evaluate from the inside out. So evaluate baby first is like the #1 rule to remember with these. All right, and then inverse functions. We covered this at the very end of the unit. Inverse functions means the inputs and the outputs switch places. Okay, so we're going to do a more thorough example of this later in the study guide, because inverse functions, this is going to be the other free response question. So there'll be 2 free response questions, one about inverse functions and one about piecewise functions. So normally the notation for this is f of -1 of x, and that would be your sign, your mathematical symbol, your sign that you're looking for a inverse function. All right, so here are your vocabulary words. We're going to use these definitions and words to solve the rest of the examples and the key concepts in this study guide. I'm going to pause this video 2. That's going to cover the key concepts 1 through 5.